Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
"Can you buy us, mister?" The whisper was nearly lost in the cold Wyoming wind, a sound too fragile for a place built on grit and desperation. Caleb Thorne, a man who had made a long peace with silence, turned. Before him stood a little girl, no older than 4, with eyes the color of a stormy sky, eyes he knew better than his own reflection. She clutched the hand of a woman on a crude wooden auction block, a woman whose face was hidden by a cascade of tangled, sun-bleached hair. The auctioneer's voice droned on, selling her off like livestock. A strong back for fieldwork comes with the child. $10. A cruel laugh cut through the crowd. Caleb's blood ran cold. He had come to this wretched outpost for a new horse, not to dredge up the ghosts of a life he'd buried 5 years ago. But when the woman finally lifted her head, the world stopped turning. It was Nora. His Nora, who had been swallowed by fire and water on the Mississippi, now stood before him in chains, a ghost made of flesh and bone and unspeakable pain. His heart, a dead thing in his chest for half a decade, hammered against his ribs. He had one chance to reclaim a life he thought was gone forever, or watch his past be sold to the highest bidder. What would you do if the ghost you mourned suddenly came back, needing a savior? Stay with us, and find out how a love thought lost can ignite a fire fierce enough to burn down the darkest of lies. If you believe in second chances, like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every heartbeat is a battle won. Part 1. The Ghost at the Auction Block. The wind that swept across the high plains of the Colorado Territory carried with it the scent of pine, dust, and decay. It was a lonely wind, one that suited Caleb Thorne just fine. For 5 years, loneliness had been his most constant companion, a silent partner in the running of a ranch that was too big and a cabin that was too empty. He'd come to the grimy trading post of Purgatory's gate for one reason: to buy a new stallion. His old bay had given up the ghost last winter, and a rancher without a horse was a man without legs. Purgatory's gate was a necessary evil, a collection of crooked stalls and muddy thoroughfares where men sold cattle, whiskey, and sometimes pieces of their own souls. Caleb kept his hat brim pulled low, his gaze fixed on the horse pens, trying to ignore the undercurrent of desperation that clung to the air like cheap perfume. He was a man who moved with a purpose that was both heavy and hollow. The grief for Nora Vance had, over the years, calcified into something hard and unmovable inside him. It was no longer a sharp, stabbing pain, but a dull, constant weight. He had the ranch they were supposed to build together, the small grove of aspens where they'd planned to build their house, and a single, faded daguerreotype of her smiling, her eyes full of a future that had burned to ashes with the wreckage of the Morning Star riverboat. He had learned to live with her ghost. It was the living he found difficult. He was negotiating the price for a sturdy-looking Mustang when a different kind of commerce caught his ear. Not the haggling over livestock, but the cold, methodical drone of a human auction. It wasn't slavery, not legally, but indenture, a loophole in the law big enough to drive a wagon through. Debtors, vagrants, and the desperate were sold into service, their lives forfeit for a handful of coins. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd seen it before, and it always left a sour taste in his mouth. He turned to leave, to put the whole ugly business behind him, but then a small voice cut through the noise. "Can you buy us, mister?" He looked down and saw her. A little girl with wide, frightened eyes, her face smudged with dirt. In her small hand, she clutched a fold of a woman's ragged dress. The woman was on the block, head bowed, her identity obscured by a curtain of filthy, matted hair. The auctioneer, a portly man with a greasy mustache, smacked a gavel against the block. Next lot. Woman and child. Good for cleaning, cooking, maybe more if you ain't particular. Comes with the brat. Quiet stock. Won't give you no trouble. A few men chuckled. Another shouted a crude remark. Caleb felt a familiar, cold rage begin to stir in the pit of his stomach. It was the same rage he'd felt as a Texas Ranger, the anger that had made him good at his job but had chipped away at his soul. He had retired from that life, but the instincts remained. He saw the tremor in the woman's shoulders, the way the little girl pressed herself against her leg, a tiny anchor in a storm of degradation. He saw a helplessness that the world was all too happy to prey upon. He should have walked away. It was not his fight. He had buried his heart with Nora, and there was nothing left in him to give. But then, as if feeling the weight of his stare, the woman on the block slowly, hesitantly, lifted her head. The light caught her face, illuminating high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a constellation of faded bruises around one eye. But it wasn't the injuries that made Caleb's breath catch in his throat. It was the face itself. It was the face that haunted his dreams, the face he saw in the flickering firelight of his empty cabin every night. It was thinner, etched with a suffering he couldn't comprehend, but it was unmistakably, impossibly, Nora's. The world tilted on its axis. The sounds of the market faded to a dull roar in his ears. It couldn't be. Nora was dead. He'd seen the official passenger list from the wreck, her name marked in black ink. He'd held a memorial service for a woman whose body was never found. And yet, there she was. Starting at $10. The auctioneer barked. Do I hear 10 for this fine piece of work? Caleb was frozen, his mind a maelstrom of shock and denial. A grizzled trapper in the front row spat a stream of tobacco juice. I'll give you 5, just to shut the little one up. The auctioneer's eyes scanned the crowd. $5 it is. Do I hear 6? Caleb's voice, when it came, was a raw, gravelly thing he barely recognized as his own. 50. A collective silence fell over the crowd. Every head turned to look at him, the tall, quiet stranger in the worn duster. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $50 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 60? Caleb's gaze never left Nora's. Her eyes, which had been vacant and dull, were now wide with a dawning, terrified recognition. A big man in a buffalo coat, clearly the trapper's competitor, sneered. 65. The contest was on, a game of pride and cruelty. But for Caleb, it was something else entirely. It was a desperate, primal need to pull her back from the abyss. 100, Caleb said, his voice as cold and hard as iron. The buffalo-coated man hesitated, then spat on the ground and backed away, shaking his head. The auctioneer, smelling a fortune, grinned. $100. A fine price for a fine specimen. Going once. He paused, milking the moment. Caleb stepped forward, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt, not as a threat, but as a habit. His eyes locked with Nora's, and in that single, shared glance, 5 years of grief, confusion, and 1,000 unanswered questions passed between them. She gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent plea for him to leave, to save himself from whatever darkness had followed her here. But Caleb Thorne had run from nothing in his life, and he wouldn't start now. The gavel fell with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden stillness. Sold. To the quiet man with the deep pockets. The finality of the gavel's strike seemed to hang in the air, thick, thick and heavy. Caleb moved through the parting crowd like a man in a trance, his boots sinking into the mud, but his mind floating somewhere above, caught between the ghost of a memory and the shocking reality before him. He reached the platform and laid the gold coins on the auctioneer's grimy table without a word, the clink of the metal sounding unnaturally loud. The auctioneer greedily swept the coins into a leather pouch, his eyes darting from Caleb to Nora with a knowing smirk, as if he were privy to a secret Caleb himself was still struggling to grasp. A man unlocked the rusty shackle from Nora's wrist, the grating sound making her flinch. She rubbed the raw, chafed skin, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, refusing to look at Caleb. The little girl, however, never broke her stare. She watched him with an unnerving intensity, as if weighing his soul. When Caleb turned to leave, the child, whose name he still didn't know, walked beside him without a moment's hesitation, her small hand reaching out to clutch the edge of his duster. Nora followed a few paces behind, a silent, shuffling shadow. The three of them walked away from the noise and stench of Purgatory's gate, leaving the whispers and curious stares behind them. They moved as a strange, broken little unit, bound together by $100 in gold and 5 years of unspoken history. The trail back to Caleb's ranch was narrow and winding, flanked by towering pines that drank the sunlight. The silence between them was a living thing, filled with the thunder of things unsaid. Caleb's mind raced. How had she survived? Where had she been? And who was this child, this small, solemn creature who looked at him with Nora's eyes? He wanted to bombard her with questions, to shake her until the truth poured out, but one look at her trembling shoulders and the vacant, haunted look in her eyes stopped him. This was not the vibrant, laughing Nora he had loved. This was a woman who had been broken and put back together wrong, a stranger wearing his lover's face. They reached the ranch as dusk was beginning to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The cabin, which had always felt like a sanctuary of solitude, now seemed to shrink in on itself, its silence accusatory. He led them inside, the warmth from the hearth a stark contrast to the cold fear radiating from Nora. He gestured towards the table. "Sit. There's stew." He moved with a stiff formality, a stranger in his own home. Nora obediently sat, pulling the little girl onto her lap and wrapping her arms around her protectively. Caleb ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed them on the table, along with a piece of cornbread. The girl ate with a ravenous hunger, but Nora only pushed the food around her bowl with a listless fork. After the meal, which was consumed in the same suffocating silence, Caleb pointed to the spare room. You can stay in there." Nora nodded, her eyes still downcast. She gathered the girl, now half asleep, into her arms and stood. For a moment, she paused at the doorway, and Caleb thought she might finally speak, might finally give him some piece of the puzzle. But she only whispered something into the child's ear and disappeared into the room, closing the door softly behind her. Caleb stood alone in the main room, the silence now deeper and more profound than ever before. He walked out onto the porch, the cold night air a welcome shock to his system. He leaned against a post, rolling a cigarette with trembling hands, and stared out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. Who was she? Was it truly Nora, or a cruel trick of the mind, a woman who bore a startling resemblance? But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was her. He could feel it. The way she moved, the shape of her hands, the quiet sorrow that had always lingered just beneath her smile. It was all there, buried under layers of trauma. He stayed out on that porch for hours, wrestling with the ghost that was no longer a ghost. He went back inside long after the fire had died down to embers. He walked to the door of the spare room and listened. He could hear the soft, even breathing of the child. He was about to turn away when he heard another sound, a soft, choked sob, quickly stifled. It was a sound of such profound grief that it felt like a physical blow. He retreated to his own cold bed, but sleep would not come. The next morning, he rose before dawn, unable to bear the confines of the cabin. He was checking the fence line near the aspen grove when he saw them. Nora and the little girl had come outside. The girl was pointing up at the sky, where the last of the stars were beginning to fade against the encroaching light. "Look, Mama," the girl's clear voice carried on the still morning air. "It's your star. The one you said would lead us home." Caleb froze, his hand tightening on the fence post. Nora knelt beside the child, her voice a low murmur he couldn't quite hear. But he didn't need to. He knew exactly which star the girl was pointing to. It was a small, bright star, part of a minor constellation they had named themselves one summer night, long ago. "That one," Nora had whispered, her head resting on his shoulder. "That'll be our star. So, if we ever get lost, we just have to look up, and we'll find our way back to each other." It was their secret, a silly, romantic notion shared between two people in love. A secret this child could not possibly know. Caleb looked from the star to the child, and then to Nora, who was now staring directly at him across the frosted field, her face a mask of undisguised terror. In that moment, the last vestiges of doubt crumbled into dust. He didn't know how, and he didn't know why, but the woman was Nora. And the child had to be his. Part 2. A scar in the shape of a star. The revelation on the frosted field left Caleb reeling, as if he'd been struck by lightning from a clear blue sky. The world he had painstakingly rebuilt over 5 years, a world of quiet routine and managed grief, had been shattered in a single moment. He stumbled back to the cabin, the truth, a wild, bucking thing in his chest. His daughter. He had a daughter. The words were alien, impossible. He looked at Nora, who had quickly herded the child back inside, and saw not just a survivor, but a keeper of secrets, a woman who had carried a piece of him through a hell he couldn't imagine. The days that followed were a tense and delicate dance. A fragile truce settled over the small cabin, thick with unspoken questions. Caleb moved with a quiet, deliberate caution, terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing, of shattering the paper-thin composure Nora seemed to wear like a shield. He learned the little girl's name was Lily. She was the only bridge between them, a small, curious creature who seemed to accept her new surroundings with a child's simple resilience. She would follow Caleb as he worked, her chatter filling the silence that had once defined his existence. She asked about the chickens, the name of his horse, and why the sky was so big. Caleb, a man more comfortable with the quiet language of horses and cattle, found himself answering her questions in a low, careful voice, a strange warmth spreading through him each time she called him Mr. Caleb. Nora remained a ghost in her own life. She performed chores with a silent, mechanical efficiency, her hands never still. She cooked, cleaned, and mended Lily's threadbare dress, her movements graceful but devoid of life. She never met Caleb's eyes. When he tried to speak to her, to gently probe the chasm of the lost years, she would flinch and retreat, her face closing off like a shuttered window. Her trauma was a wall between them, and he had no idea how to breach it. He saw it in the way she started at loud noises, the way she would sometimes stare into the middle distance, her eyes seeing things that weren't there. At night, he would hear her muffled cries through the thin cabin walls, a sound that tore at the fabric of his soul. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems with his hands or his gun. But this was a wound he didn't know how to heal. His frustration grew alongside a fierce, protective instinct. This was his family, his Nora, his Lily. And he would be damned if he let the world break them any further. He began leaving small offerings for them on the porch, a handful of wildflowers for Nora, a smoothly carved wooden bird for Lily. They were small, clumsy gestures, his only way of saying the things he couldn't put into words. Lily accepted her gift with a bright, gap-toothed smile. Nora would simply take the flowers inside without a word, but the next day, he would see them in a glass jar on the windowsill, a tiny crack in her armor of indifference. One evening, a week after their arrival, the fragile peace was broken. Lily, who had been uncharacteristically quiet all day, began to cough, a dry, rasping sound. By nightfall, she was burning with fever. Her small body trembled under the blankets, and she whimpered for her mother in a pained, delirious voice. Nora knelt beside the bed, her face a mask of frantic terror. She bathed Lily's forehead with a cool cloth, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She murmured soothing words in a voice cracked with fear, but the fever only seemed to climb. Caleb watched from the doorway, a helpless giant. He saw the panic in Nora's eyes, the raw fear of a mother who had already lost too much. This was not something he could fix with a fence post or a firearm. Setting his jaw, he stepped into the room. "Let me," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Nora looked up, her eyes wide and defensive, clutching Lily closer as if he meant to take her away. "I know some remedies," he said gently. "My father taught me. For fevers. Please, Nora." He used her name for the first time since her return, and the sound of it hung in the air between them, heavy with shared history. For a long moment, she stared at him, a battle raging in her eyes. Then, with a shuddering sigh, she relented, moving aside to let him near the bed. Caleb worked with a focused calm, grinding herbs into a paste and brewing a willow bark tea. He moved around the small room with a quiet confidence, his presence a steadying force against the tide of Nora's panic. He held the cup to Lily's lips, coaxing her to drink the bitter liquid. He sat by her bedside, replacing the cool cloth on her forehead, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as it brushed stray hairs from her flushed cheek. Nora watched him from a corner of the room, silent and unmoving, her arms wrapped around herself. He could feel her gaze on him, feel the weight of her fear and her confusion. In the flickering lamplight, tending to the sick child they had made together, the wall between them began to feel, for the first time, like something that could be overcome. They were no longer just a man and a woman haunted by the past, but a father and a mother fighting for their child's future. The night stretched on, a long, dark corridor of fear. The only sounds in the cabin were Lily's shallow, ragged breaths and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Caleb and Nora kept a silent vigil, two solitary lighthouses guarding a single, flickering flame. Caleb's initial confidence began to wane as the hours passed and the fever refused to break. He had exhausted his knowledge of prairie remedies, and the thought of the nearest doctor, a full day's ride away, was a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He saw the same fear reflected in Nora's eyes, a hollowed-out look that spoke of a deep familiarity with loss. She had not spoken a single word to him directly, but a silent understanding had formed between them in the crucible of their shared anxiety. They moved around each other with a grim, synchronized purpose, united in their fight against the invisible enemy attacking their daughter. Towards the hour just before dawn, when the darkness is at its deepest, Lily began to convulse. A terrible, guttural cry tore from Nora's throat, a sound of pure, animal anguish. She lunged for the child, but Caleb was faster. He gently but firmly turned Lily onto her side, clearing her airway, his movements swift and sure, born of grim experience on battlefields and in ranger camps. "It's the fever breaking," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble meant to calm Nora as much as to convince himself. "Hold on. We just have to hold on." The seizure passed as quickly as it had come, leaving Lily limp and drenched in sweat. But her breathing, though still weak, was deeper, more even. The trembling had subsided. Caleb placed a hand on her forehead. The skin was still hot, but the raging fire had banked to smoldering embers. Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over him. He looked up and met Nora's gaze across the small bed. Her face was streaked with tears, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror. In her eyes, for the first time, he saw not a ghost, but a flicker of gratitude. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the window, Lily finally fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Caleb, bone-weary but unwilling to leave her side, gently rearranged her blankets. As he tucked the quilt around her shoulder, his fingers brushed against the delicate skin behind her ear. He felt it then, a small, raised mark. Curious, he gently tilted her head to get a better look in the growing light. His heart stopped. There, just beneath her earlobe, was a tiny, perfectly formed scar in the shape of a star. He stared at it, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He knew that scar. He had traced it with his fingertips 1,000 times. He had kissed it in moments of quiet intimacy. It was Nora's scar, the result of a childhood fall from an apple tree. He remembered the day she told him the story, laughing as she called it her own personal constellation. It was an intimate part of her, a tiny map of her history. And it was printed on the skin of this child. The implication crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. A scar like that wasn't inherited. It wasn't a birthmark. There was only one way it could be there. A memory, sharp and vivid, pierced the fog of his mind. A night in a hotel in St. Louis, the night before Nora was to board the Morning Star. A night filled with whispered promises and desperate, passionate love. A night he had tried for 5 years to forget, because the memory was too painful to bear. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and backed away from the bed. He looked at Nora, who was watching him with a new kind of fear in her eyes, a fear of discovery. The silence stretched, taut and screaming. All the pieces fell into place, her impossible survival, the child who looked so much like him, and now this, an irrefutable, scarring piece of proof. His voice was a choked whisper. The scar. Nora's face crumpled. The dam of her carefully constructed silence, a wall she had hidden behind for 5 long years, finally broke. A sob tore through her, a raw, ragged sound of grief and relief and unimaginable pain. She collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking with the force of her weeping. The story, when it finally came, poured out of her in a broken, fragmented torrent, the words tumbling over each other as if they had been held back by a great weight for too long. She spoke of a man, a powerful, wealthy man named Judge Sterling Blackwood. He had been obsessed with her, had pursued her relentlessly, and had refused to accept her rejection. The fire on the riverboat hadn't been an accident. It had been a diversion, a cover for his men to abduct her. They had taken her west, held her captive, and told her Caleb had died searching for her. They had forced her into a life of servitude, a prisoner in a gilded cage. "I found out I was pregnant on the journey," she choked out, her words barely audible through her sobs. "When I told him, he was furious. He wanted me, but not another man's child." She looked up at Caleb, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "He let me keep her. But he hurt me, Caleb, to punish me for carrying you inside me. One night, he used a hot poker from the fire. He said he was branding his property." She touched the scar behind her own ear. "And then he did the same to her, to Lily, a newborn baby. He did it to mark her as mine, and therefore his." The horror of her words washed over Caleb, a sickening, volcanic rage that threatened to consume him whole. He looked from the sleeping, innocent child to the broken woman on the floor, and the last 5 years of his life reformed into a new and terrible shape. His grief had been a lie. Her death had been a lie. And his daughter had been born into a nightmare. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before Nora. He didn't speak. He simply opened his arms. She fell into his embrace, her small body racked with sobs, and for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Thorne held Nora Vance and let his own silent tears fall into her hair. Part 3. The Judge's Shadow. In the aftermath of the storm, a fragile quiet descended upon the ranch. Nora's confession, though horrific, had acted as a release, breaking the suffocating silence and allowing something new and tentative to grow in its place. The truth, as brutal as it was out. The name of their enemy, Judge Sterling Blackwood, hung in the air, a promise of a battle yet to come. But for now, in the calm that followed, they focused on the small, simple act of healing. Lily's fever broke completely, and with the return of her childish energy, a semblance of normalcy returned to the cabin. For Caleb, knowing the truth changed everything. The confusion that had clouded his mind was replaced by a cold, clear certainty. This was his family, and he would protect them with his last breath. The rage he felt toward Blackwood was a white-hot coal in his gut, but he knew that a blind charge would do them no good. The man was a judge, a figure of power. This fight would require more than just a fast draw. It would require patience and a plan. He began to teach Nora how to shoot. He started with a rifle, its long range better suited to her cautious nature. At first, she flinched at the loud report, the smell of gunpowder stirring old fears. But Caleb was a patient teacher. He stood behind her, his large hands guiding hers, his voice a low, calming murmur. "Don't fight it, Nora. Breathe. Feel the weight of it. Make it a part of you. You ain't a victim. You're a survivor. Survivors fight back." Day by day, he saw a change in her. The act of holding the weapon, of controlling its power, seemed to restore a piece of the agency that had been stolen from her. Her aim grew steady, her shoulders straightened, and a flicker of the old, defiant Nora began to reappear in her eyes. While Nora found strength in the rifle, Caleb found a new purpose in Lily. He was a father. The reality of it was still a strange, ill-fitting coat, but he wore it with a growing sense of pride. He started building a proper swing for her in the branches of the old oak tree, the same tree where he and Nora had carved their initials years ago. He taught her how to ride his gentle old mare, walking alongside her, one hand steadying her on the saddle. Her laughter, bright and unrestrained, was a sound he hadn't realized how much his life had been missing. He saw Nora watching them from the porch, a small, hesitant smile on her lips. They began to talk, not yet about the past, but about the future. They spoke of planting a garden, of repairing the roof before the winter snows, of what books Lily might like to read. They were small conversations, careful steps across a bridge they were building together, plank by plank, over a chasm of pain. One afternoon, while they were mending a fence, Nora spoke of Maria, another woman who had been held at Blackwood's estate. "She was brave," Nora said, her voice distant. "She tried to help me. I don't know what happened to her after I was moved." A seed of an idea began to form in Caleb's mind. A witness. Someone who could corroborate Nora's story. Finding this Maria was a long shot, but it was the first tangible piece of a plan. The evenings became a time of quiet peace. After Lily was asleep, they would sit by the fire, the comfortable silence of old friends settling between them. One night, Caleb took out his worn guitar, an instrument he hadn't touched since Nora had died. He strummed a few chords, his fingers clumsy at first. Then he began to play a soft, familiar melody, the song he had written for her the summer they fell in love. Nora looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't speak, but she moved from her chair to sit on the floor by his feet, leaning her head against his knee, just as she used to do. He kept playing, the music weaving a thread of continuity between the boy and girl they had been and the man and woman they were now becoming. In that moment, surrounded by the warm glow of the firelight, with his daughter sleeping safely in the next room and the woman he loved by his side, Caleb felt a sense of rightness, of homecoming, that he had thought was lost to him forever. He knew the shadow of Judge Blackwood was still out there, long and dark. He knew the fight was coming. But for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. And he finally had something worth fighting for. The idyllic peace they had carefully cultivated was as fragile as a desert flower, and they both knew it. Every rider spotted on the horizon, every unfamiliar sound in the night, was a source of fresh anxiety. Caleb oiled his guns with a grim regularity, and Nora never strayed far from the cabin without the rifle he had taught her to use. They were living on borrowed time, a small island of hope in a sea of encroaching danger. The blow, when it came, was not the violent, chaotic raid they had braced for. It arrived on a bright, cloudless afternoon, in a cloud of dust that signaled the approach of several riders. Caleb was instantly on alert. He sent Nora and Lily inside the cabin, positioning himself on the porch, his Winchester resting casually in his arms. He watched as 3 men rode into his yard. 2 were armed deputies, their badges glinting in the sun. But it was the man in the center who made Caleb's blood run cold. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a fine black suit, his silver hair shining beneath a clean, stylish hat. He dismounted with an easy grace, his movements fluid and confident. He had the calm, predatory air of a wolf who knew he owned the forest. This had to be him. Judge Sterling Blackwood. Blackwood smiled, a thin, bloodless slash of a smile that didn't reach his cold, intelligent eyes. "Caleb Thorne," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, utterly out of place in the rustic setting. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle. "I don't know who you are, mister, but you're trespassing on my land." The judge chuckled softly, a dry, rasping sound. "Oh, I think you do know who I am. And I am not trespassing. I am here on official business." He produced a folded piece of paper from his inner coat pocket. "This is a court order, signed and sealed, for the return of my wife, Eleanor Blackwood, who is currently residing on these premises." Caleb stared at him, dumbfounded. "Your wife? You're insane. Her name is Nora Vance." Blackwood's smile widened. "Ah, yes. One of her unfortunate delusions. The poor woman has suffered a breakdown of the mind. She imagines all sorts of fanciful stories, calls herself by her maiden name. It's a tragic affair, really." He gestured to one of the deputies, a young, nervous-looking man named Hank Miller. "Deputy, kindly inform Mr. Thorne of the legal ramifications of harboring a fugitive from her husband's care." Deputy Miller cleared his throat, avoiding Caleb's gaze. "Sir, the order states that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood is to be returned to the custody of her legal husband. Interference is a federal offense." The sheer, audacious brilliance of the lie was breathtaking. Blackwood wasn't using brute force. He was using the law itself as his weapon. He had twisted the truth into a legal document, turning Caleb from a protector into a criminal. The cabin door creaked open, and Nora stepped out, the rifle held tightly in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a cold fire. "He's lying," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "My name is Nora Vance. This man is my kidnapper." Blackwood sighed dramatically, a mask of feigned sadness on his face. "You see, gentlemen, the delusion is quite profound. It breaks my heart to see her this way." He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a soft, menacing tone meant only for Nora and Caleb. "Come now, Eleanor. This foolishness has gone on long enough. You've had your little adventure. It's time to come home." The word home was laced with such venom, such a clear threat of the horrors that awaited her, that Nora visibly flinched. Caleb raised his Winchester. "You take one more step, and I'll put a hole in you, judge or no judge." Blackwood stopped, his smile finally vanishing. His eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. "You are making a grave mistake, Thorne. You think that rifle gives you power? I am power. I am the law in this territory. You are just a sad, lonely man clinging to a fantasy. The court has declared her my wife. The law says she belongs to me." He held up the court order. "This piece of paper is more powerful than any gun you own." He turned to Deputy Miller. "Disarm him." The two deputies drew their pistols, their movements hesitant but determined. Caleb was trapped. He could shoot, and maybe he'd even get Blackwood, but he'd be gunned down by the deputies, leaving Nora and Lily completely defenseless. He would be branded a cop killer, and no one would ever listen to their story. With a surge of impotent rage, he slowly lowered the Winchester and let it fall to the porch. Blackwood nodded, satisfied. He turned his cold gaze back to Nora. "I am a reasonable man," he said, his voice once again smooth as silk. I will not drag you out of here kicking and screaming. That would be unseemly. I will give you 24 hours to come to your senses and return to my custody willingly. If you are not in my carriage by noon tomorrow, these deputies will be authorized to use whatever force is necessary to retrieve my property." He let the word property hang in the air, a final, cruel twist of the knife. He mounted his horse, his victory total and absolute. As he turned to leave, he looked directly at Caleb, his eyes glinting with malicious triumph. "It was a pleasure to finally meet the ghost my wife is so fond of," he said. Then he and his deputies rode away, leaving Caleb standing, disarmed and utterly defeated, in the shadow of a man who had turned the law into his own personal cage. Part 4. Whispers in the Courthouse. The departure of Judge Blackwood left a void in the yard, a vacuum filled with a silence more menacing than any threat. The dust settled, but the chill of his presence lingered, clinging to the air like a shroud. Caleb stood frozen on the porch, his hands clenched into useless fists, the feeling of impotence a bitter poison in his throat. He had faced down outlaws, navigated treacherous ambushes, and survived the brutalities of the war, but he had never felt so utterly powerless. Blackwood hadn't beaten him with a gun, he'd beaten him with a piece of paper. Inside the cabin, the silence was just as profound. Nora had herded Lily into the small bedroom, and now she stood in the center of the main room, her body rigid, her face a pale, emotionless mask. But Caleb could see the terror swirling in the depths of her eyes, a storm held back by the sheer force of her will. The legal trap was perfect. Any act of violence from Caleb would only validate Blackwood's claims, painting him as an unstable brute holding a delusional woman captive. They were checkmated. The law, the supposed shield of the innocent, had been turned into their cage. "We could run," Caleb said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Head north, into the territories. Lose ourselves where his reach can't follow." Nora turned to him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of anger in her eyes. "And what kind of life would that be, Caleb? Looking over our shoulder every day? Teaching our daughter that the only answer to evil is to hide from it? He would hunt us. Men like him, they don't stop. It's not about me anymore, not really. It's about the insult you paid him by existing. He would spend his fortune to see us dragged back in chains, just to prove he could." She was right. He knew she was right. Running was just a slower way to lose. Despair, cold and heavy, began to settle over Caleb. He paced the length of the small cabin, a caged animal. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to meet violence with violence, but his mind could find no way around the legal fortress Blackwood had built. He looked at Nora, truly looked at her, and saw not just the victim of Blackwood's cruelty, but a woman with a keen, strategic mind, sharpened by years of survival. She had endured the unthinkable, and it had left her with a clarity that he, in his rage, was lacking. "He's a man, Caleb," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Not a demon. Men have weaknesses. They have secrets. His power comes from his reputation, his position. If we could damage that, if we could prove he's a liar..." A new path, narrow and fraught with peril, began to open in Caleb's mind. She wasn't talking about a courtroom battle. They could never win that. She was talking about finding a truth so undeniable it would shatter Blackwood's legal armor. "Maria," Caleb said, the name a single spark of hope in the darkness. "If we could find her, if she would testify." Nora's expression was grim. Finding her would be like finding a single stone in a riverbed. And even if you did, she is terrified. She saw what he did to people who crossed him. She wouldn't speak. "I'll make her speak," Caleb said with a grim determination. "No." Nora corrected him gently. "You won't make her do anything. You will ask her. You will show her that she is not alone, that there is a chance for justice. You will tell her about Lily." The plan was desperate, a long shot fired into the dark, but it was better than the alternative of waiting for the inevitable. They had less than 24 hours. Caleb would have to ride hard and fast, following the faintest of trails from Nora's memory, a name of a town, a description of a foreman, scraps of conversations overheard years ago. It was a fool's errand, and they both knew it. As night fell, a heavy sense of dread permeated the cabin. Caleb was preparing to leave, packing light. Jerky, a canteen, and his Colt. Leaving Nora and Lily here, unprotected, felt like leaving a part of his own soul behind. He found Nora sitting at the table, writing furiously on a piece of paper by lamplight. It was a detailed account of her abduction and captivity, naming names, dates, and locations she remembered. "If I don't make it back," Caleb started to say, but she cut him off. "When you make it back," she said, her voice firm. "But just in case, give this to the deputy, Miller." There was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. Maybe he's not like the others. Before he left, he went into the bedroom to look at Lily. She was sleeping soundly, one small hand clutching the wooden bird he had carved for her. He felt a surge of love so fierce it was painful. This was the reason. This was the why. He bent down and kissed her forehead, a father's silent promise. He found Nora waiting for him on the porch, the rifle in her hands. She wouldn't be a helpless victim. She would be a guardian. He pulled her into his arms, a desperate, fierce embrace. "Be safe, Nora." "You be fast, Caleb," she whispered back into his shoulder. He swung himself into the saddle and rode out into the moonless night, a lone rider on a desperate quest, the fate of his family resting on the hope of finding one brave woman in a wilderness of fear. The darkness was Caleb's ally. He rode hard, pushing his horse through the night, sticking to the old cattle trails and shadowy canyons he knew from his ranger days. He avoided the main roads, knowing that Blackwood's influence stretched far and wide, his eyes and ears present in every town and livery stable. The judge would expect him to run, probably with Nora and Lily. He would have men watching the main routes north and west. But Blackwood wouldn't expect this, a direct, targeted search for the one person who could dismantle his empire of lies. Caleb was not just a rancher, he was a hunter, and the skills he had tried to bury were now resurfacing with a grim necessity. He navigated by the stars, his mind a map of the territory, piecing together the fragmented clues Nora had given him. A place called Silver Creek, a mention of a mining company that used indentured labor, a cruel foreman with a scarred face. It wasn't much, but it was a trail, and Caleb was an expert tracker. He rode with a relentless pace, stopping only to water his horse and chew on a piece of dried jerky, his body aching but his mind sharp and focused. Every rustle in the brush, every distant coyote howl, set his nerves on edge. He wasn't just racing against time, he was moving through enemy territory. Back at the ranch, a different kind of hunt was beginning. Deputy Hank Miller couldn't shake the image of the scene at the Thorne Ranch from his mind. He was a young deputy, ambitious and eager to follow the letter of the law. He revered Judge Blackwood, a man who represented order and authority in a chaotic land. But something had felt profoundly wrong. It wasn't just the raw terror in the woman's eyes, or the cold, possessive way the judge had spoken of her as property. It was Thorne. Miller knew of Caleb Thorne by reputation, a quiet, solitary man, but a former ranger with an impeccable record. He was not the kind of man to fly off the handle, to kidnap a judge's wife on a whim. The story didn't fit the man. Miller's conscience was a nagging, persistent itch. He found himself at the county courthouse, ostensibly filing paperwork, but his feet carried him to the records room in the dusty basement. Under the guise of searching for an old land deed, he began to look for Judge Blackwood's marriage license to an Nora Vance. He found nothing. There was no record of the marriage in this county, or any of the neighboring ones he had telegraph access to. It was a small inconsistency, but a significant one. A man of Blackwood's stature would have had the marriage properly recorded. Fueled by this small discovery, he started looking deeper. He pulled the files on the riverboat disaster of the Morning Star. He found the official casualty list. There, in stark black ink, was the name, Nora Vance, presumed deceased. There was no mention of an Eleanor Blackwood. He cross-referenced the timeline. The disaster had happened a month after Blackwood had supposedly married his Eleanor. The pieces didn't fit. The judge's story, so seamless and authoritative on the surface, was beginning to show cracks. Miller felt a knot of fear and excitement tighten in his stomach. He was treading on dangerous ground, questioning a man who could end his career with a single word. But the badge on his chest meant something to him. It meant protecting the innocent, not just enforcing the orders of the powerful. He was beginning to suspect that in the case of Thorne versus Blackwood, the law and justice were on two different sides. Meanwhile, after a hard day and night of riding, Caleb arrived at the outskirts of Silver Creek. It was less a town and more a sprawling, grimy mining camp, filled with the sullen, exhausted faces of men who were little more than slaves to the company store. Based on Nora's description, this was the place. He tethered his horse in a hidden grove and entered the camp on foot, his duster pulled tight, his hat low. He moved through the camp with a practiced invisibility, listening to the snippets of conversation, his eyes searching. He was looking for a community within the camp, a place where the Mexican laborers gathered, a place where a woman like Maria might hide. He found it behind the main slag heap, a small collection of shanties, separate from the rest of the camp, where Spanish was spoken in low, guarded tones. He approached cautiously, his hand never far from his gun. This was the end of the trail. Now, he just had to convince a ghost to speak. Part 5. The Devil's Gambit. The shantytown was a place of deep shadows and deeper mistrust. Faces peered at Caleb from behind burlap curtains, their expressions guarded and suspicious. He was an outsider, an Anglo, and his presence here was an intrusion. He moved slowly, his hands kept in plain sight, trying to project an air of non-aggression. He asked for Maria by name, his voice low and respectful, but was met with shakes of the head and dismissive shrugs. They were protecting their own. He was about to give up hope when an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, beckoned him with a subtle nod towards a small, dilapidated shack at the edge of the settlement. Caleb approached the door and knocked softly. After a long moment, the door creaked open a few inches, and a pair of dark, fearful eyes peered out at him. "What do you want?" a woman's voice asked, laced with a heavy accent and heavier fear. "My name is Caleb Thorne," he said. "I'm looking for Maria." I was sent by Nora Vance. The name hung in the air like a ghost. The door immediately began to close, but Caleb put his boot in the way, stopping it. "Please," he said, his voice stripped of all authority, leaving only raw desperation. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need your help." The door opened wider, and he finally saw her. She was older than he'd expected, her hair streaked with gray, her body thin and wiry from a life of hard labor and fear. The haunted look in her eyes was one he recognized. It was the same look Nora had worn when he first found her. She let him in, but her posture was defensive, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist. The inside of the shack was bare, but clean. "You should not have come here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You should not have said that name." "Nora is alive," Caleb said, getting straight to the point. "She's with me. But Blackwood has found her. He's using the law to try and take her back. He has a court order saying she is his wife." Maria let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "The law? The law is whatever that devil says it is. I saw what he did. I saw it all. The beatings. The other girls who disappeared. He is not a man. He is a monster who wears a fancy suit." "Then help me," Caleb pleaded. "Testify against him. Tell the world what you saw. Your testimony, along with Nora's." Maria recoiled as if he had struck her. "No. You are insane. Do you know what he would do to me? He would find me, no matter where I hid. He would make my death slow and terrible. I have a family, grandchildren. I will not sacrifice them for a ghost." Her fear was a palpable thing in the small room, a thick, suffocating blanket. Caleb saw that threats or demands would be useless. He had to reach the woman, not the witness. He changed his tactics, his voice softening. "Nora told me you were brave. She said you tried to help her." Maria looked away, a flicker of old pain on her face. "Bravery is for those who have nothing left to lose. I have too much." "So do I," Caleb said quietly. He reached into his saddlebag, which he'd carried in with him, and pulled out the small, crudely carved wooden bird. He held it out on his calloused palm. "I have a daughter," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "Her name is Lily. She's 5 years old. She has Nora's eyes. Blackwood. He knows she's my child. A constant reminder that he never truly owned Nora. He wants her back to punish Nora, and to break me. He wants to own my little girl, too." He saw a flicker of something in Maria's eyes. He pressed on, his words coming from a place of deep, paternal terror. "Nora told me what he did. About the scar. How he heated a poker in the fire and branded Nora like she was an animal." Maria flinched, her hand unconsciously going to her own shoulder, where Caleb guessed a similar mark was hidden. "He did the same thing to my daughter," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "He took that same hot piece of metal and pressed it into the skin of my newborn baby girl. To mark her. To show that she belonged to him." The air went out of the room. Maria stared at the small wooden bird in Caleb's hand, and then up at his face, seeing not a gunslinger or a lawman, but a father, terrified and desperate. The shared experience of Blackwood's specific, intimate cruelty, the horror of branding a child, had forged a bridge between them across the chasm of their fear. Her defensive posture slowly crumbled. The hard lines of her face softened, and her eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of a fierce, rekindled anger. She thought of her own grandchildren, of their innocence, and she looked at the symbol of Lily's stolen innocence in Caleb's hand. "He marked a child?" she whispered, the words filled with a horrified disbelief that hardened into resolve. She looked Caleb directly in the eye, and for the first time he saw not a frightened victim, but a warrior. "No man who harms a child deserves to hide behind the law," she said, her voice low and steady. "No man. Get your horse. We ride now." The sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows in the yard of the Thorne Ranch. It was high noon. The deadline. Nora stood by the window of the cabin, the heavy Winchester rifle in her hands. She had braided her hair into a tight, practical plait, and her face, though pale, was set with a grim determination. She had sent Lily into the bedroom with strict instructions to hide under the bed and not make a sound, a game of hide-and-seek with the highest stakes. Nora was no longer the broken, silent woman from the auction block. She was a mother defending her cub, and she would not be taken again without a fight. She watched the cloud of dust on the horizon resolve into 3 riders, Judge Blackwood and his 2 deputies. They rode into the yard and dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate, confident in their victory. Blackwood smoothed his suit jacket, a cruel, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Eleanor, my dear," he called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "Your time is up. Do be a sensible woman and come out. Let us not have any unpleasantness in front of the child." The cabin door remained shut. Nora raised the rifle, its cold stock pressed against her cheek, and aimed it squarely at Blackwood's chest. She could end this right now. One pull of the trigger. But she knew it would also be the end for her. The deputies would gun her down, and Lily would be left alone, an orphan in the clutches of this monster. Her finger tightened on the trigger, her mind a whirlwind of impossible choices. "I will not ask again," Blackwood said, his voice losing its silken edge and taking on a hard, dangerous tone. He nodded to his deputies. "Go in and retrieve my wife." Just as the deputies took a step towards the porch, another sound cut through the tense silence, the thunder of approaching hooves from the opposite direction. Everyone turned. It was Deputy Hank Miller, riding hard, his horse lathered in sweat. He reined in sharply, positioning himself between Blackwood and the cabin. He was holding up a piece of paper. "Judge!" he shouted, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "A telegram from the territorial marshal in Denver. On the basis of new evidence, your legal authority in this matter has been suspended pending a federal investigation." Blackwood's face, a moment ago so confident, contorted into a mask of disbelief and fury. "What is the meaning of this, Miller? What evidence?" Before Miller could answer, another rider appeared on the ridge overlooking the ranch. It was Caleb, and he was not alone. Seated proudly on the horse beside him was Maria, her back straight, her face a testament to quiet courage. Blackwood stared at Maria, his composure finally shattering. He saw his meticulously constructed world of power and lies crumbling before his very eyes. The law had failed him. His intimidation had failed. In that moment, the veneer of the sophisticated judge vanished, and the raw, rabid animal beneath was unleashed. "No!" he roared, a guttural sound of pure rage. Just then, the cabin door flew open, and Lily, hearing Caleb's voice, ran out onto the porch, shouting, "Papa!" In a flash, Blackwood moved. He lunged onto the porch, faster than anyone thought possible, and snatched the little girl. He drew a small, silver-plated derringer from a hidden pocket and pressed its muzzle against Lily's temple. "Everyone stay back!" he shrieked, his eyes wild, his arm locked around Lily's chest. "This is not over. She is mine. All of them are mine." Nora let out a strangled cry, her rifle suddenly useless. Caleb, on the ridge, froze, his heart seizing in his chest. A tense, terrible standoff ensued. Caleb's mind raced, his ranger training kicking in, assessing angles, searching for an opening. "Let her go, Blackwood," Caleb said, his voice deceptively calm as he slowly began to dismount. "It's over. You've lost. I never lose." Blackwood screamed, dragging Lily back towards his horse. Caleb knew a direct shot was impossible. The risk to Lily was too great. He needed a diversion. His eyes darted around the yard, landing on the large water trough near the porch. He locked eyes with Hank Miller, who stood frozen, his own gun drawn but useless. Caleb gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards the trough. Then he shouted, "Now! Hank!" Miller, acting on pure instinct, fired his pistol into the wooden trough. The shot splintered the wood, and a huge spray of water erupted, dousing Blackwood and his horse. The horse reared in panic, neighing loudly. For a split second, Blackwood's grip on Lily loosened as he fought to control his mount and shield his eyes. It was the only opening Caleb needed. He had already been moving, closing the distance with a silent, deadly speed. He launched himself at Blackwood, not with a gun, but with his body. He slammed into the judge, his arm wrapping around Blackwood's gun hand, forcing the derringer upwards. The small gun fired with a harmless pop into the air. Caleb twisted, using Blackwood's momentum against him, and threw him from the horse. The judge landed hard in the mud, the air knocked from his lungs. Caleb was on him in an instant, his knee on Blackwood's chest, his Colt now pressed firmly between the man's terrified eyes. Nora ran and swept a crying Lily into her arms, holding her tight. It was over. The devil was in the dirt, disarmed and defeated, not by a bullet, but by the combined courage of a father's love, a mother's defiance, a deputy's conscience, and a survivor's voice. Part 6. A Promise on the Prairie. The capture of Judge Sterling Blackwood sent shockwaves through the territory. He was not just a corrupt official, he was an institution, a spider at the center of a vast web of corruption, blackmail, and human trafficking that had held the region in a grip of fear for over a decade. Maria's testimony, supported by the meticulous evidence Deputy Miller had begun to uncover, was the key that unlocked it all. Once Blackwood was in federal custody, others began to come forward, frightened merchants, blackmailed politicians, and, most powerfully, 2 other women who had been listed as deceased and were living in hiding. The judge's shadow, which had seemed so permanent and all-encompassing, began to recede under the harsh light of justice. For Caleb, Nora, and Lily, the end of the battle brought a strange and profound quiet. The constant, thrumming tension that had been their companion for weeks finally eased, leaving behind an exhaustion that was bone-deep. The community, which had initially viewed Caleb with suspicion, now saw him as a hero. Neighbors would stop by, leaving pies on the porch or offering a helping hand with the ranch work. They looked at Nora not with pity, but with a deep, quiet respect. They saw not a victim, but a woman of incredible strength who had faced down a monster and won. Deputy Hank Miller, now promoted to sheriff after his predecessor was implicated in Blackwood's network, became a regular visitor and a trusted friend. He would often sit on the porch with Caleb, sharing a coffee and the latest news from the ongoing investigation, two men bound by the moment they chose justice over the law. But the true healing was happening within the walls of the small cabin. The fear that had been a constant resident was slowly being evicted, replaced by the sounds of a family. Lily's laughter became a common sound, echoing through the house as she played. She no longer had nightmares, and the name Blackwood was never spoken again. Nora, freed from the weight of her past, began to truly come alive. The ghost was gone, and in her place was the vibrant, intelligent, and compassionate woman Caleb had fallen in love with. She found a new purpose. Noticing that many of the local ranch children had no formal education, she started a small, informal school right there at the ranch. She used smooth river stones for letters and charcoal on salvaged planks for a blackboard. It started with Lily and two neighbor boys, but by the end of the month, a dozen children were gathering at the Thorne Ranch every morning, their bright, eager faces a testament to the new life Nora was building from the ashes of her old one. Caleb would often pause in his work just to watch her. He saw her patience with the children, the way her eyes lit up when one of them finally learned to spell their name. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering belief in a better future. The love he had felt for her, a love he had preserved in the amber of grief for 5 years, was now alive and growing, deeper and stronger than he had ever thought possible. He wasn't just in love with the memory of the girl she had been, he was in awe of the woman she had become. The ranch, once his sanctuary of solitude and sorrow, had transformed. It was no longer just a piece of land with a cabin on it. It was a home, filled with warmth, learning, and the promise of a future that was finally their own. The echoes of the past were fading, replaced by the clear, bright sound of a new song. One late afternoon in early spring, when the wildflowers were carpeting the prairie in a riot of color, Caleb asked Nora and Lily to go for a walk with him. He didn't say where they were going, only that it was a place he wanted to show them. He led them away from the ranch, up a gentle, sloping hill to a small grove of aspen trees. The leaves trembled in the breeze, sounding like a soft, whispering river. The air was clean and sweet with the scent of new grass and damp earth. In the center of the grove stood a particularly large, old aspen, its smooth, white bark covered in the carved memories of travelers and lovers past. "This is the place," Caleb said softly. "This is where we were going to build our house. Right here." He ran his hand over the bark of the large tree until he found what he was looking for. There, faded by 5 years of sun and snow, but still clearly visible, were their initials, carved inside a lopsided heart. C. T. plus N. V. Nora stared at the carving, her fingers tracing the familiar lines. A single, silent tear rolled down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release, of a long-overdue homecoming. Lily, too young to understand the weight of the moment, but sensing its importance, looked from the tree to her parents' faces with wide, curious eyes. Caleb knelt down so he was at eye level with both Nora and Lily. He took Nora's hand in his. "I carried a lot of ghosts for a long time, Nora. The ghost of you, the ghost of the life we were supposed to have. I thought this place was a graveyard for all those dreams." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's not. It's just been waiting. For you. For us." He reached down, not into his pocket, but to the ground beside him. He picked a long, tough, pliable strand of prairie grass. His large, calloused hands, so capable with a rope or a rifle, moved with a surprising delicacy as he began to braid it. "I don't have a ring for you," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Gold and silver, they don't feel right. They don't tell our story. Our story is this land. It's tough, it's resilient, and it's come back to life after a long, hard winter." He finished the simple braid, a perfect, tiny circle of green and gold. He gently took Nora's left hand and slipped the blade of grass onto her ring finger. It was more beautiful and more meaningful than any diamond could ever be. "Nora Vance," he said, his voice steady and clear. "You came back from the dead and taught me how to live again. Will you be my wife? Will you build a life with me, right here, and fill it with laughter and too many children?" Nora was crying freely now, but she was smiling, a brilliant, radiant smile that outshone the setting sun. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, Caleb, yes." Then Caleb turned to Lily, who was watching them with a solemn sweetness. He held out his other hand to her. "Lily Vance, I wasn't there when you were born, and I can't ever get that time back. But I swear to you, I will be here for every single day from now on. Will you let me be your papa?" Lily didn't need words. She threw her small arms around Caleb's neck and hugged him with all her might. "You already are," she said into his shoulder. Caleb wrapped his arms around both of them, his two girls, his entire world. He held them close as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. They were not two broken people trying to piece together a life. They were a family, forged in fire, bound by a love that had refused to die, and finally home. The wind whispered through the aspen leaves, carrying with it not the echoes of a painful past, but the promise of a beautiful future, a promise made on the prairie. The story of Caleb, Nora, and Lily is a testament to the enduring power of the human heart, a reminder that even in the desolate landscapes of the Wild West, hope can take root and blossom. It teaches us that love is not about the promises we make in the sunshine, but about the hands we hold in the storm. It's a story of how one person's courage can ignite a fire in others, and how true justice is not always found in a courtroom, but in the unwavering resolve to protect the ones you love. Their journey proves that family is not just a matter of blood, but a choice you make every single day, a choice to heal, to fight, and to build a future, even when the past has left you with nothing but ashes. Here at Wild West Love Stories, we believe these are the tales that truly define the frontier. Not the gunfights and gold rushes, but the quiet, epic battles of the heart. If this story of a love that conquered death, defied tyranny, and built a home from scratch resonated with you, then you've found your tribe. Like this video. If you believe in second chances, share it with someone who needs a story of hope, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. You won't want to miss another story of the fierce, unbreakable love that was forged in the heart of the Wild West.